It's called the butterfly effect. And it's a true story, and I'm going to explain it to you, and then I'm going to show it to you, and then I'm going to prove it to you. The butterfly effect affects you. Here's what it is. Back in 1963, a long time ago, a man named Edward Lorenz came up with this idea. Lily, come up here. What's your name? Jalen? Jalen, come up here. This was Edward Lorenz's idea. Lily, you are going to be the earth.
Oh my gosh.
There you are. You're standing right here, okay? Edward Lorenz's idea was this. That if there was a butterfly on one side of the earth, and that butterfly flapped its wings. Flap your wings. Flap them harder. Flap them harder. And if a butterfly flapped its wings hard enough that as it flapped its wings, it would displace air. And as it displaced air, it would displace more. Keep flapping. Rotate the world. There we go. More air would be displaced. More air would be displaced until by the time all that air got on the other side of the world, it would cause a hurricane. That's what Edward Lorenz said. It looks something like this. Let's put there. Thank you, guys. It looks, have a seat. It looks something like this. The butterfly on one side of the world would flap its little tiny wings and displace air, and by the time it got on the other side of the earth, a hurricane would be formed. That sounds crazy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And guess what? Everybody in the scientific community said, Edward Lorenz, you're absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
It can't be done. It can't happen. But guess what?
It happened.
In 1994, scientists found out that Edward Lorenz was right. So much so that they gave this idea the status of a law. Like the law of gravity. You've heard of that, right? Gravity works whether you know it or not. They gave it the status of a law, and here's what it's called, a big giant name, the law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. It's a big giant word.
Yes.
But what it means is the butterfly effect. If this makes it easier, this is what it means. The scientific phenomenon by which small changes create big impacts. That's what that butterfly did, right? Little tiny butterfly made a huge impact. And they found out that it works, and it works every time. And guess what?
What?
It works on you.
What?
Every single time. And it works this way. And this is what I want you to get out of all of this. We're going to read this, okay? This is what I want you to get from the butterfly effect. 4th grade, Columbine, how in the world can the butterfly effect affect me? Every choice that you make, and every action that you take or don't take matters to everyone. And I can prove it. And I really want to prove it to you. And so here we go into this little walk into history of how I can prove to you that the butterfly effect works, and it works on you. That every choice that you make, every action that you take or don't take matters to everyone. To me, to the person beside you, to the people in 1st grade and the people in 2nd grade, to your Columbine family. How many of you watch TV? Really? You watch TV now? Not just on your phones. You watch TV. How many of you are familiar with a station called ABC?
Nope.
No? ABC.
ABC Network.
You can put your hands down. ABC, a long time ago, Mrs. Messner might remember this, and I don't know if they still do this. But on the news at night, they used to have, on Friday, they used to have the person of the week. And the person of the week would be somebody who did something. And ABC News would tell you about it. Well, a while back, ABC News did a person of the week on a person named Norman Borlaug. Now that name shouldn't ring a bell with you. You don't know who Norman Borlaug is, do you?
I heard the last name.
You've heard of the last name. I'm going to tell you about Norman Borlaug. Norman Borlaug liked plants. He was a botanist. And he came up with a way to grow wheat in the desert.
What?
Yeah, it's quite amazing, isn't it? Yeah. And because he was able to do that, you know, in the desert they can't grow things. And when you can't grow food, you can't eat. And when you can't eat, you die. Norman Borlaug came up with a way to grow what was called dwarf wheat in the desert. And he is credited with saving over 2 billion people's lives. One action that a man took saved 2 billion lives.
What?
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know.
But what if, and here's where the what if comes in. What if it wasn't really Norman Borlaug who saved those 2 billion people's lives?
Oh, man. It was the beginning.
What if it was a man named Henry Wallace?
I know it.
Now, Henry Wallace shouldn't ring a bell with a fourth grader either.
It does.
But I'm going to say a couple names and maybe they will. Have you ever heard of a person called Franklin Roosevelt?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Franklin Roosevelt was what?
A president.
He was a president.
The fifth president or something?
Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a president. And this Henry Wallace just happened to be one of his vice presidents.
What?
Henry Wallace was one of our vice presidents of the United States. Nobody knows him. But he was. But I'm going to tell you a little story about Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace loved plants. And Henry Wallace used to be, before he was the Vice President of the United States for Franklin Roosevelt, he used to be the Secretary of the Agriculture. And the Secretary of the Agriculture is kind of in charge of things that grow in the United States and how we plant things and different experiments. And Henry Wallace used that power of the Vice Presidency to start an experiment. And he started the experiment down in New Mexico. And it was an experiment of how to grow wheat. And he hired a man to run this experiment. And that man's name was Norman Borlaug. So see, maybe it really wasn't Norman Borlaug that saved 2 billion people's lives. Maybe it was Henry Wallace who saved 2 billion people's lives.
I know the last name.
One person's actions that he takes saved 2 billion people's lives.
Or what if it was the other?
But what if it wasn't Henry Wallace? What if it wasn't a Henry Wallace? What if it was a man, and you might know this name. What if it was a man named George Washington Carver? Does that ring a bell?
Yeah.
Who was George Washington Carver? No? Yes? Max, do you know? Not George Washington. George Washington Carver. Do you know who George Washington Carver was? No. George Washington Carver loved plants. And he figured out so many different ways to do things with a peanut.
Oh, peanut? Yeah.
I'm talking all kinds of things to do with a peanut. George Washington Carver went to a college called Iowa State University. And in Iowa State University, he had a teacher.
Wait, how are all these people connected?
Hold on. Iowa State University, he had a teacher. And this teacher absolutely loved plants. It was his botany teacher. And on the weekends, he would encourage George Washington Carver to go out on these little journeys to look at plants and to study plants and to really, understand what he was studying. And this professor had a little 6-year-old son. And he would have George Washington Carver take this 6-year-old son with him on these botanical journeys.
There's somebody else. What?
Okay. It would take on these botanical journeys this little 6-year-old. And this little 6-year-old's name was Henry Wallace. So Henry Wallace...
All connecting.
It is all connecting, isn't it?
No, I don't believe it.
Henry Wallace would go on these journeys and he found a love of plants. And so maybe it just wasn't Henry Wallace who saved 2 billion people's lives. Maybe it was George Washington Carver.
Oh, I don't know.
But what if? What if it was a man? And this is the story I want you to get. What if it was a man named Moses Washington?
Moses.
Let me tell you the story of Moses Washington. Moses Washington lived in a time back in the Civil War, back in 1863. And it was during the time of during the Civil War. It was a time of slavery. And Moses Washington's wife, named Susan, had a friend whose name was Sarah, and she was a slave. And at some point in time, a group of people came and took Sarah and her little baby and captured them. And Susan was so upset that she asked Moses, "Do you think you can find her?" And so Moses did as much as he possibly could to find her. And he ended up making a meeting with a group of people who had taken her. And on a cold night in December, he took his horse and he traveled 20 miles on horse to meet these men. He knew that Sarah was already dead. But he met them and he traded his only horse for this burlap sack that these men had. They took his horse and they took that burlap sack and they threw it into the snow. And Moses Washington picked up that burlap sack and opened it up, and inside was Susan Washington's little 6-month-old baby.
And that baby.
And he picked it up and he put it in his coat and he walked 20 miles back home. And as he was doing that, he would talk to this little baby. And he said, "I'm going to raise you as my own, but I'm going to honor your mother." And that's how that little baby got the name George Washington Carver. So you see, maybe it wasn't George Washington Carver that saved 2 billion people's lives. Maybe it was Moses Washington.
No, it wasn't him.
But what if? Do you see where I'm going with this, though? Do you see how it all connects? Do you see how everyone's actions, every action that they take, connects and affects you, and worked all the way down from the Civil War, put your hands down, all the way down to the Civil War to save 2 billion people's lives in the desert. Every action that you take, every choice that you make matters to everyone. Not only just in school, but in your life outside of school. I really want you to get that. And here's why I want you to get that. Because the next picture is really the picture that I want to show you of why I want you to understand that every action that you take or don't take matters. That's Sadie. That's my granddaughter. And I love that baby girl. I love her to death. But here's what I know. The world that she's going to grow up in is going to be determined by the choices that you make and the actions that you take. So see, I'm not expecting you to make good choices. Or I'm not hoping that you make good choices. I'm expecting you to make good choices. Because of this little baby girl. She's going to grow up in the world that you make for her. Every action that you take, every choice that you make matters.